The grand hall of the royal court was alive with whispers. The walls were lined with alien leaders and dignitaries from distant planets, all gathered to witness an event that could change the future of their galaxy. At the center of it all stood Princess Leora, her eyes carefully scanning the crowd. She was the jewel of the kingdom, known for her beauty, wisdom, and grace. Yet as she stood there, adorned in shimmering robes, something within her stirred, an unease that no amount of royal training could quell. The king, her father, sat at the throne, his regal face stern as he observed the proceedings. His gaze never left the princess, his most precious asset, as he began the ceremonial speech that would bind her future to the kingdom's politics. She was to be married to a powerful leader from a neighboring system, a political alliance that would strengthen the kingdom's position in the galaxy. But as the king spoke of alliances and prosperity, Princess Leora's thoughts drifted. She had spent years learning the ways of court, understanding the rules that governed her life. But none of that felt real to her now. She wasn't just a symbol for peace. She wasn't just a pawn in a game of politics. She was a person, a woman, with her own desires and dreams, and none of them matched the future her father had carefully planned for her. The crowd was silent, hanging on the king's every word. But then, as if out of nowhere, a figure stepped forward. He wasn't one of the dignitaries, nor was he anyone of importance in the eyes of the court. He was a human, an outsider, dressed in simple attire that did nothing to match the grandeur of the royal setting. His sudden appearance startled the entire room. A low murmur spread through the court, and the king's face tightened. Who dares interrupt the royal proceedings? He demanded, his voice commanding and filled with anger. The human, however, didn't flinch. He stepped forward with an air of quiet confidence, his gaze fixed on Princess Leora. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. There was something in the way they looked at each other, something unspoken, something undeniable. The princess felt her heart race. This human, with his plain clothes and unknown origins, had captured her attention. The king, realizing the shift in the room, waved his hand to dismiss the interruption, but the human was already speaking. "I've come for the princess," he said simply, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs of shock and disbelief. The words hung in the air, heavy and defiant. No one in the court had ever dared challenge the king's authority, not in such a public and bold way. But this human, this stranger, had just claimed the princess in front of her father, in front of everyone. The king's face darkened, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You will regret this," he muttered under his breath. But there was nothing he could do. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt helpless. The princess, torn between shock and an unexpected surge of relief, knew one thing for certain: her life had just changed forever. The room was still, except for the sound of Princess Leora's quick breaths. She couldn't take her eyes off the human. He was standing just a few feet away from her, surrounded by the shocked faces of court members. His confidence was unsettling, and yet there was something in his gaze that made her heart flutter. It wasn't fear, but something else, a feeling that was completely new to her. She had been raised in a world where control was everything. The king, her father, had shaped her life with careful plans. Marriages were arranged, alliances were made, and her role as the princess was always clear. She never questioned it. Until now. Until the human. She had never seen him before. He didn't belong here. His presence was out of place, yet there was something familiar in the way he held himself, like he was meant to be here, in this very moment. She wasn't sure why, but she felt drawn to him in a way that unsettled her. The human's eyes, dark and intense, locked with hers. His stare was unwavering, as if he knew exactly who she was. There was no judgment, no awe, just understanding. It was as if he saw her for what she truly was, not the princess, not the symbol of peace, but a person, a woman. For a long moment, the silence stretched between them. The court was still in shock, whispers barely audible in the background. But to the princess, everything else faded away. It was just the human and her. She finally broke the silence. "Why are you here?" Her voice was soft, but the question was clear. She had to know. She needed to understand what had brought him here. The human took a step forward, his calm demeanor never wavering. "I came to speak with you," he said. His voice was steady, yet there was a hint of something beneath it, a sense of urgency. "I have information, something you need to know." Princess Leora's curiosity was piqued, but she didn't speak right away. Her father, the king, was still sitting on his throne. His eyes narrowed with fury. He had been silent ever since the human made his bold declaration, but his anger was palpable. The room was thick with tension. The human took another step closer to the princess, not paying attention to the king or anyone else in the room. His focus was solely on her. "I've seen the way you look at this life," he continued. "You don't want to be a puppet for your father's kingdom. You want more than that." The princess flinched, surprised by how accurately he described her feelings. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever seen through the layers she had carefully built. She had always felt trapped, bound by duty, but she had never said it aloud. How could he know? The human gave her a small, understanding smile. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said softly, "but to offer you a choice." Princess Leora felt a strange pull toward him. It was as if he understood her more than anyone else ever had. She had always been alone in her thoughts, trapped in a world where no one listened to what she really wanted. But this human, this stranger, had somehow found a way into her heart. And for the first time, she wondered what it might be like to follow his lead. But she couldn't show that, not yet. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice firm. The human smiled again. "Nothing," he said simply, "but I think you know what you want." Her heart raced. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she couldn't deny the connection she felt. She looked over at her father, who was watching her every move with growing concern. But in that moment, she realized something. She had a choice, and for the first time in her life, she could make it on her own. The tension in the room was thick. The court, once filled with lively whispers, had fallen into a heavy silence. Princess Leora felt every eye on her, but her gaze remained fixed on the human before her. There was something about him, something undeniable, that made her heart beat faster. Her father, the king, watched from his throne, his anger barely contained. He had never felt so powerless. The human didn't seem to notice the intense stares or the growing hostility. He stood tall, calm, and composed, as though he had expected this reaction. His confidence was both strange and comforting to Leora, but it also unsettled her. She had never been one to defy her father or the court, and yet something about the human's presence made her feel like she could. After a moment of silence, Leora took a deep breath and spoke. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying an edge of authority. "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" The human's eyes softened, as though he had been waiting for her to ask that very question. "I don't want anything from you," he replied, his voice steady and sure. "But I believe you deserve more than this." He waved a hand to encompass the entire court. "More than this life that's been forced upon you." The princess felt a chill run down her spine. His words struck a chord deep inside her, but she couldn't show it. Her duty, her obligations, her father's wishes, they had always come first. She was the princess, the future ruler. Her life was not her own. "You don't know anything about my life," she said quickly, almost defensively. "I can't just run away. My kingdom needs me." The human nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I know," he said, "but that's exactly why I'm here, to give you a choice." Before she could respond, the human took a step forward. He wasn't afraid, not of the king, not of the court, not of anything. "You don't have to stay here. You don't have to follow this path." He paused, then added softly, "You can choose your own future." Leora's heart raced. She knew the weight of her father's words, knew the consequences of disobeying him. The court was waiting for her response, their eyes full of expectation. She could feel her father's stare burning into her, willing her to stay, to obey. But the words of the human echoed in her mind. "You want me to leave?" she asked, more to herself than to him. "To just walk away from everything?" The human nodded. "Yes, you have the power to change your destiny, princess, but only if you take that first step." For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, to everyone's shock, the princess made a bold decision. She stood tall and turned her gaze toward her father. "I am not a pawn," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "I will not be used for political gain any longer." The king's face turned crimson with anger. "Leora," he shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. "You are mine. You are the future of this kingdom." But Leora didn't flinch. She turned back to the human and gave him a small nod. Without another word, she stepped toward him, her mind set on the unknown future that awaited her. "Let's go," she said. The human smiled, extending his hand. "You won't regret this." The princess took his hand, feeling the surge of freedom rush through her. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. As Princess Leora stepped away from her father's throne, her heart pounded in her chest. She had just made the most dangerous decision of her life. The eyes of the entire court followed her every movement, but she couldn't bring herself to care anymore. For the first time in years, she felt alive. The human beside her was calm, his hand still holding hers. He had not once hesitated or shown fear, not even when the king's voice thundered through the room. There was a quiet strength in him that Leora hadn't expected, and it comforted her in a way she hadn't realized she needed. But as she glanced back at her father, she saw the rage in his eyes. The king's face was twisted in disbelief, his hands clenched into fists. He couldn't understand why his daughter, his heir, his future, would choose a stranger over him, over the kingdom he had built. "You will regret this, Leora." The king's voice cracked through the silence, sharp and full of venom. "You are my only heir. You are the future of this empire. You can't just run away." Leora stood still for a moment, her gaze fixed on the king, but her heart was elsewhere. The weight of her father's words pressed against her chest, but she knew, deep down, that this was the only way she could ever be free. She had spent her whole life doing what was expected of her, but she could no longer ignore the growing emptiness inside her. Turning her back on her father's throne, Leora spoke with newfound strength. "I am not your possession, Father. I am a person, not a tool for your plans. I've spent my life trying to live up to your expectations, but it's time for me to live my own life." The king's face turned a deep shade of crimson, his mouth opening as if to shout, but the words never came. Instead, he looked at her as if she were a stranger. A look of utter betrayal crossed his face. "You are making a terrible mistake," the king said softly, his voice trembling with anger and hurt. "I gave you everything, Leora. Everything." The princess didn't answer. She didn't need to. She could feel the years of resentment and frustration building up inside her. This was the moment she had dreamed of, standing up for herself, for what she believed was right. The human beside her took a step forward, his presence steady and reassuring. "We should leave now," he said, his voice calm but urgent. Leora nodded, finally feeling the weight of the court lift from her shoulders. She turned to face him completely. "I'm ready." Without another word, the princess and the human walked toward the exit. The court was silent, the whispers fading into nothingness as they passed. The king's eyes followed them, his gaze cold and unyielding, but there was nothing he could do now. His daughter had made her choice, and the future of the kingdom had just changed forever. Once outside, the cool air hit Leora's face, and for the first time in years, she felt free. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was in control now. The human smiled at her, his eyes full of understanding. "This is just the beginning, princess. We had a long road ahead." Leora smiled back, a sense of hope rising within her. "I know," she replied. "But for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid." Princess Leora and the human walked briskly through the royal corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence that followed their bold exit. The sound of her father's fury still rang in her ears, but she couldn't bring herself to feel regret. For the first time in her life, she had made a choice for herself. She wasn't a mere princess tied to a throne anymore. She was free. But as they reached the palace gates, the weight of what she had just done began to settle in. She had left behind everything: her family, her title, and the kingdom that had been her whole world. There was no turning back now. The human turned to her, sensing her unease. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Leora nodded, though her mind was racing. "I think so. But I don't know what happens next." She glanced back at the palace, feeling the sudden pang of doubt. "My father, he won't let me go so easily." The human gave her a reassuring smile. "You've already taken the first step. He can't stop you now. Besides, you have me by your side." She looked at him, grateful for his support, but unsure of what kind of future awaited them. "But what will we do? Where will we go?" "Wherever you choose," the human replied. "The galaxy is vast. There are places where no one will know who you are, where you can live on your own terms." Leora felt a sense of calm wash over her, but that calm was quickly interrupted by a loud roar from behind. The sound of clanging metal reached their ears, and Leora turned to see a group of royal guards rushing toward them. The king's fury had already set things into motion. "They're coming," Leora whispered, her heart racing. The guards had orders to bring her back, no matter what it took. The human looked at her, his eyes narrowing with determination. "We need to move quickly." Without another word, they turned and fled down a narrow path behind the palace. The guards' shouts grew louder, but Leora had never felt so alive. She wasn't running away in fear. She was running toward freedom. As they reached a small shuttle hidden behind the palace walls, the human quickly opened the door and ushered her inside. "Hurry," he said. "We don't have much time." Leora climbed into the shuttle, her heart pounding in her chest. The human followed, and before the doors closed, she looked out one last time at the palace. Her father's kingdom, her past, it was all fading away. The shuttle roared to life, lifting off from the ground and soaring into the sky. Leora felt a mixture of fear and excitement. The future was uncertain, but she had made her choice, and there was no turning back. As the palace grew smaller in the distance, the human turned to her, his face serious. "Your father won't stop until he has you back. We'll have to be careful." Leora nodded. "I understand, but I'm not going back. I won't live my life in his shadow anymore." The human smiled. "Good. Then let's start a new chapter." The shuttle flew through the dark void of space, leaving the palace behind in its wake. Princess Leora sat in silence, her fingers gripping the seat as she looked out at the stars. They were beautiful, endless, and full of possibilities. For the first time in years, she felt free. Yet, beneath that feeling, there was a knot of uncertainty in her stomach. The human beside her was calm, his hand steady on the controls. He glanced over at her, sensing her unease. "You're thinking about your father, aren't you?" he asked softly. Leora nodded, her mind racing. "I left everything behind. My family, my kingdom. I can't help but wonder if I've made the right choice." The human didn't look at her as he answered, his voice quiet but firm. "You made the choice that was right for you. The life you were living wasn't your own. You were never free, Leora. But now you are." She turned her gaze back to the stars, the silence between them comforting, yet heavy with the weight of what they were running from. Her father's anger still echoed in her ears. She could almost hear his voice, commanding her to return. He would stop at nothing to bring her back. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that she had made a mistake, a part of her knew deep down that there was no turning back. She couldn't go back to that life. The life where her every move was controlled, where her worth was only tied to the crown on her head. "I've never been outside my kingdom before," Leora said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never realized how small my world was until now." The human smiled at her, his eyes full of understanding. "That's the beauty of the universe. There are so many places, so many worlds. You can be whoever you want to be." As they continued their journey through the stars, Leora felt a strange sense of excitement. The unknown stretched out before her like a vast canvas, waiting to be filled with new experiences. She could already feel the weight of the crown she had left behind growing lighter. But still, doubt lingered. Would she ever be free from her father's shadow? The human broke the silence again. "I know this isn't easy. Your father won't give up. He'll send his people after us. But we have time. We need to find a place where no one will look for us." Leora nodded, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon ahead. "And where do we go? Where can we hide from him?" The human's smile grew wider. "There's a place, far from here. A planet in the outer rim of the galaxy. It's quiet, uncharted, and no one will think to look there." Leora felt a spark of hope. A new life. A new beginning. "Exactly," the human said. "But first, we need to get there without being caught." As the shuttle sped through space, the princess could feel her heart begin to settle. She had chosen this path, and with the human beside her, she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't just running away from her past. She was running toward her future. The shuttle glided smoothly through the darkness of space, the stars shining like distant beacons in the cold void. Princess Leora leaned back in her seat, her thoughts racing. She had left everything behind. Her kingdom, her family, the life that had been planned for her since birth. Now it was just her and the human, traveling toward the unknown. The human pilot was focused on the controls, his eyes scanning the navigational data. He had been quiet for most of the journey, but Leora knew there was something on his mind. The pursuit was inevitable. Her father wouldn't let her go so easily. "He's coming for us, isn't he?" Leora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The human didn't look at her, but his tone was calm when he replied, "Yes, your father will send everything he has after us. He won't stop until he brings you back. But we're ready for him." Leora felt a shiver run down her spine. She had always known her father to be ruthless. But now, for the first time, she truly understood the extent of his power. He had everything. Resources, soldiers, ships. He could make her life unbearable if he wanted to. "What if we can't outrun them?" she asked, her fear creeping into her voice. The human finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We will. We have a head start, and we'll be taking some detours that will confuse any trackers. We're not just running, we're outsmarting them." Leora nodded, trying to trust his confidence, but deep down, a part of her was terrified. She had never been chased before. She had never had to look over her shoulder, wondering when the next danger would strike. The human seemed to sense her unease. "We're not the only ones out here in the stars, Leora. There are places where no one will think to look for us. We just have to get there." "And where is that?" Leora asked, her curiosity piqued. "Where are we going?" He paused for a moment, then looked at her with a determined expression. "There's a planet on the outer rim. It's far from the core systems, a place where things are forgotten, left behind. There's no galactic law out there, no control. It's a place where we can hide, regroup, and figure out our next move." Leora's eyes widened. "A place like that exists." "It does," the human said with a nod. "But getting there won't be easy. We'll need to avoid detection, and we'll have to take risks. Your father's ships will be searching the core planets first, but once we get past that, we'll be safe." Leora's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and fear. The idea of escaping to a place where no one knew her, where she could start fresh, was both thrilling and terrifying. She looked at the human, grateful for his guidance, but uncertain about the road ahead. "We'll make it," the human said, sensing her hesitation. "Trust me, we're in this together." For the first time in a long while, Leora allowed herself to believe him. The unknown future was still uncertain, but with the human beside her, she knew she wasn't alone. And for now, that was enough. As they continued their journey, Leora looked out into the endless stretch of space, ready for whatever came next. The chase had begun, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She was moving forward, one step at a time, into a future she could finally call her own. The shuttle's engines hummed steadily, but Princess Leora couldn't shake the tension building inside her. The stars outside were nothing more than distant points of light, and yet they seemed to mock her. She was free, at least for now. But she knew her father, the king, wouldn't give up easily. He would find her. It was only a matter of time. The human beside her, ever calm, glanced at her with a knowing look. "We're not there yet, but we will be. Keep your focus." Leora nodded, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on her chest. Her father had resources beyond imagination, and his rage was a force of nature. She could already feel the dread of his pursuit lingering in the air. She had always feared disappointing him. But now, her fear had taken on a different shape. She feared what he might do to her, and to the human who had helped her escape. "We can't keep running forever," Leora said quietly, breaking the silence. "Sooner or later, he'll find us." The human met her gaze, his expression steady. "We're headed for the outer rim, to a place where the kingdom's influence won't reach. He's searching the core worlds now, and by the time he figures out where we're going, we'll be long gone." Leora wasn't so sure. Her father's reach extended far beyond what the humans seemed to understand. But she had no choice but to trust him. She had chosen this path, and there was no turning back now. Hours passed, and the tension only grew. Leora found herself staring out of the shuttle window, watching the stars drift by, knowing that her life was about to change forever. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. She had taken the first step toward freedom, but she couldn't escape the feeling that the king wasn't going to let her go without a fight. Suddenly, the human's voice broke through her thoughts. "We've got company." Leora snapped her head around, her heart racing. The human's fingers flew across the shuttle's control panel, checking the readings. "We've been detected," he said. "They're closing in on us." Fear surged through Leora. "My father, he's found us." "Not yet," the human replied quickly. "But his fleet's sending out search drones. We need to act fast." The human's hands moved expertly as he initiated evasive maneuvers, the shuttle dipping and swerving through the vastness of space. The chase had begun, and Leora could feel her pulse quicken with every twist and turn. Her father's ships would be relentless, but so was the human by her side. As the shuttle shot forward, Leora gripped the seat. "What happens if they catch us?" The human looked at her, his eyes filled with resolve. "They won't. We'll outrun them." But Leora wasn't so sure. Her mind raced through the possibilities. The consequences. Her father's wrath was something she had always feared. But now, there was no turning back. The princess had made her choice, and it was time to face the consequences. The human smiled at her, a glimmer of confidence in his eyes. "You made it this far, Leora. You're not going back." Leora held her breath, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. She had chosen her freedom. She had chosen a future that was her own. And now, it was time to see if she could outrun the past. The shuttle jolted as it swerved sharply to avoid a laser blast. Princess Leora gripped the seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the hum of the ship's engines as the human pilot expertly navigated through the asteroid field, weaving between massive rocks that seemed to be closing in on them from all directions. The king's fleet was catching up fast, and Leora could feel the pressure building. "They're getting closer," she shouted, her voice filled with panic. The human didn't look at her, his eyes focused on the display in front of him. "I know," he said calmly, "but we've got a few tricks left." Leora's eyes darted to the monitor, where the red dots marking the enemy ships were blinking dangerously close. She could see the flashing symbols of pursuit, the king's ships trailing them like a shadow. "I don't think we can outrun them forever," Leora said, her voice tight. The fear she had been pushing down all this time was starting to surface. Her father was relentless, and he wouldn't stop until he had her back. The human's voice remained steady. "We don't need to outrun them forever. We just need to get far enough ahead so we can make the jump." "The jump?" Leora asked, confusion in her voice. "What are you talking about?" The human smiled briefly. "The Outer Rim, remember? The place I told you about. It's uncharted and off the grid. We just need to get there and jump into the deep space lanes. They won't be able to follow us." Leora nodded, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The deep space lanes were isolated and nearly impossible to track, but they were also dangerous. It was a risk, but it was their only option. The shuttle lurched again, and Leora's heart skipped a beat. The laser blasts from the king's fleet were getting closer. She looked at the human, who was working frantically at the controls. His face was set in concentration, but there was a calmness to him that made her feel just a bit safer. He wasn't afraid. And maybe, just maybe, he had a plan. "We're almost there," the human said, his voice steady as ever. Lyra's eyes moved to the stars outside. She could see a faint glimmer of hope in the distance, a dark gap between the stars that led to the deep space lanes. But before they could reach it, another explosion rocked the shuttle, and the warning lights flashed red. "They'd locked onto us," Leora said, panic rising in her chest. "We're not going to make it." "We are," the human replied. "Hold on." He punched a button, and the shuttle jerked forward at incredible speed. The stars outside blurred as they entered the gap, the deep space lanes opening up before them. The king's fleet wasn't far behind, but it was too late. The human had already started the jump. The shuttle shot forward with a burst of light, and for a moment, everything was still. The roar of the engines faded, and all Leora could hear was the rush of her own breath. They were in the deep space lanes, free for now. Lyra exhaled slowly, relief flooding through her body. "We did it." The human nodded, his face showing the slightest hint of a smile. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we've bought ourselves some time." Leora looked out the window at the endless black of space. They had escaped, but the fight was far from over. She had made her choice, and she would fight for her freedom, no matter the cost. The shuttle flew through the vast expanse of deep space, far from the reach of the king's fleet. Princess Leora sat in the cockpit beside the human, staring out at the endless blackness. They had made it, for now, at least. But she knew they weren't truly safe. Not yet. Lyra's mind was a whirlwind. She had left everything behind. Her kingdom, her father, her old life. The freedom she had longed for was now within her grasp, but it came at a cost. Her father's wrath, his pursuit, and the consequences of her decision still loomed over her. She turned to the human, who was busy checking the ship systems. His face was focused but calm, as if he didn't carry the weight of what they had just escaped. "You think they'll stop?" she asked quietly, her voice uncertain. The human glanced at her, his eyes steady and reassuring. "They'll keep looking, but they won't find us here. We're far enough out that even the king's best ships won't be able to track us. We have time." Leora nodded, trying to push away the lingering doubts in her mind. The fear of being caught by her father was still there, but she knew she had made the right choice. She had chosen to live for herself, to be free from the constraints of her royal duties. She would not go back. "So, what now?" she asked, a trace of uncertainty in her voice. The human smiled slightly, his expression softening. "Now, we rest. We take some time to plan. There's a lot ahead of us, and we need to be ready." Leora sighed, feeling the weight of everything settle into her bones. She hadn't realized how much tension had built up in her body until now. The flight through deep space had been a blur, and now that they were safe, exhaustion was setting in. "I never thought I would be here," she murmured, looking out the window at the stars. I never imagined this kind of life. I always thought I had to live for my father, for the kingdom. But now, the human turned to her, his gaze soft but understanding. Now you have a chance to live for yourself. And that's something most people never get. Leora felt a small smile tug at her lips. It was strange. This sense of freedom. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she could shape it. I don't know what's next, she said honestly, but I know one thing for sure. I don't want to go back. The human nodded. And you won't have to. The future is yours to make. They both sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the shuttle's engines the only sound filling the cockpit. Lyra looked out at the stars, knowing that the path ahead would not be easy, but it would be her own. Her father's voice, angry and filled with disappointment, echoed in her mind. But she pushed it away. She had made her choice, and no matter how hard the road ahead, she was determined to see it through. She turned to the human, a sense of calm settling over her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." The human gave her a small smile. "You don't have to thank me. I'm with you every step of the way." And as they continued their journey through the stars, Leora finally understood something she had never known before. Freedom wasn't just about escaping. It was about choosing to live, to make decisions for herself, and to face whatever came next with strength and courage. The past was behind her. The future, uncertain as it was, lay ahead. And with that thought, Leora felt a sense of peace she had never known before.